World War ended. The world hoped peace had come at last. But in the lands of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the silence after the guns was only the beginning of another storm. Foreign troops marched into ancient cities. Old dreams of empire flickered back to life. And across the Aegean, two nations looked at the same coast and saw destiny. For Greece, it was a return to the lands of their ancestors. The megali idea, the dream of a greater Greece reborn from the ruins. For the Turks, it was survival, a fight to reclaim their homeland from occupation and humiliation. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922 would decide not only the fate of millions, but also the birth of modern Turkey and the end of Greater Greece. It was a war of hope and heartbreak, of soldiers who marched believing they carried history's blessing, and civilians who fled through fire and ash. Tonight, we relive that story, from the armistice that promised peace to the burning of Smyrna that turned it to tragedy. You are watching Erahive, where history speaks, the aftermath of empire. The guns had fallen silent across the Middle East, but silence is not the same as peace. When the armistice of Mudros was signed in October 1918, the Ottoman Empire, once the ruler of 3 continents, was broken. Its armies were scattered, its people were starving, and its ancient capital, Constantinople, waited nervously for what came next. Then came the ships. One morning, the mists of the Bosporus parted, and the silhouettes of Allied warships appeared, massive and silent, sliding toward the Golden Horn. The city that had survived crusades and sieges watched as British, French, and Italian soldiers marched ashore. They didn't come as liberators. They came as owners of a prize. Inside the Sultan's palace, the lamps still burned at night. Mehmed VI, the Sultan, signed documents he no longer controlled. His ministers whispered about cooperation. But outside the palace gates, everyone knew the empire was finished. Across Anatolia, Turkish villages were left in ruins. Men who had survived the trenches of Gallipoli and the deserts of Arabia returned home to find empty fields, graves where their families had been, and flags they didn't recognize flying over government buildings. And far away, across the Aegean Sea, another nation watched all this collapse and saw opportunity. In Athens, Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos studied the maps of the old empire and saw more than borders. He saw memory. He saw Ionia, Thrace, Smyrna, lands where Greek communities had lived for centuries. In his mind, history was calling Greece to return. It wasn't just politics, it was a dream. The megali idea, the great idea, to reunite all Greeks under one flag, to restore what Byzantium had once been, to walk again where their ancestors had built temples and cities. And for the first time in centuries, that dream seemed possible. The Allies, Britain, France, and Italy had defeated the Ottoman Empire. Venizelos believed Greece had earned its reward. But even as he made his case in Paris, others whispered warnings. British generals cautioned that occupying Turkish lands would ignite rebellion. French diplomats feared chaos in the Middle East, yet the dream was too powerful to resist. For the Greeks, it was destiny. For the Turks, it was a wound that had just begun to bleed. In that fragile winter after the Great War, 2 nations, one reborn and one dying, began walking toward each other, and between them lay the ashes of an empire, still warm from the fires of history. The landing at Smyrna. The morning of May 15, 1919, began with sunlight spilling over the calm waters of the Aegean. From the horizon came the low hum of engines and the glint of steel. The people of Smyrna gathered at the docks, men in suits, women clutching rosaries, children climbing onto barrels just to see. And then they saw a fleet of Greek ships easing into the harbor, flags snapping in the breeze. Some fell to their knees and wept. For them, this was not an invasion. It was a homecoming, a promise that centuries of struggle under Ottoman rule were finally over. But not everyone shared their joy. In the narrow lanes and shaded courtyards of the Turkish quarter, blinds were drawn and doors locked. To the city's Muslim residents, this liberation was something else entirely. The arrival of strangers claiming what was still their home. On the decks, Greek soldiers adjusted their uniforms. Many were barely 20, their rifles polished, their hearts full of pride. They had been told they were coming as peacekeepers, that the Allies had invited them to restore order. But when they stepped onto the pier, the world turned chaotic. A shot rang out, then another. Panic rippled through the crowd. In minutes, the air was filled with screaming. Greek troops, confused and frightened, opened fire. Turkish civilians ran for cover. The cobblestones turned red. By sundown, hundreds were dead, and the promise of peace had burned away. News of the bloodshed raced across Anatolia. To the Greeks, it was an accident. To the Turks, it was an occupation drenched in blood. And from that day, the word Smyrna would no longer mean a city. It would mean betrayal. In the hills beyond the city, men began to gather. Farmers, students, ex-soldiers, forming small bands of resistance. They called themselves the Kuvayi Mili, the national forces. They had few weapons, but they had fury. They struck Greek patrols at night, vanished into the hills, and swore that Smyrna would one day be avenged. Back in Athens, Venizelos celebrated the landing as a triumph of Greek destiny. But in the shadows of Anatolia, another destiny was awakening, one led not by kings or empires, but by a soldier who refused to surrender his homeland. His name was Mustafa Kemal, and with Smyrna's flames still smoldering, he began to gather the fragments of a broken nation and turn them into something unstoppable. The rise of Mustafa Kemal. The smoke from Smyrna had barely drifted away when whispers began spreading across Anatolia, whispers of a soldier who had not given up. His name was Mustafa Kemal Pasha, and to many, he was the last hope of a humiliated nation. Kemal had seen empires fall before. He had fought at Gallipoli, faced defeat in the deserts, and watched comrades die under flags that no longer flew. But what he saw now, Allied soldiers walking freely through Constantinople, Greek troops raising their flag over Smyrna, was something worse than defeat. It was erasure. In the spring of 1919, under the pretense of inspecting demobilized Ottoman troops, Kemal boarded a ship to the Black Sea coast. He was supposed to calm unrest. Instead, he would ignite a revolution. When he stepped ashore in Samsun, the rain was falling hard, the kind that turns roads into rivers and hides the sound of footsteps. He looked out at the gray horizon and knew what had to be done. He sent messages to loyal officers. The nation is in danger. We must act over the next weeks. He traveled across the heart of Anatolia, Amasya, Erzurum, Sivas, towns worn thin by war and famine. In every meeting hall, in every dimly lit room, he spoke the same words. Salvation will not come from the Sultan. It will come from the people. His charisma was quiet but unshakable. He convinced hesitant soldiers to join him, tribal leaders to lend support, and towns to raise what little food they had for his cause. Soon his signature began appearing on orders not from the empire, but from the nation. And so the national movement was born. In Constantinople, the Sultan called him a traitor. The Allies demanded his arrest, but by the time their orders reached the interior, Kemal was already untouchable. In Ankara, a lonely city of dust and wind, he built something new, a parliament. No royal seals, no foreign advisors, just a gathering of men who believed that Turkey could stand on its own again. They called themselves the Grand National Assembly, and from this small room on the Anatolian plateau, they would defy the entire post-war order. Then came the Treaty of Sèvres, the paper that tried to finish what the war had started. It stripped the Ottomans of almost everything, from Armenia to Mesopotamia. Even the Straits and Smyrna were lost. The Sultan signed it without protest, but Kemal's voice thundered back. This treaty does not bind a free people. To many, it sounded like madness. To those in the hills and villages, it sounded like hope. Greece now held the coast. The Allies held the capital. But in the heart of Anatolia, a new Turkey was being forged. In secret meetings, in whispered oaths, in the steady rhythm of boots marching toward the unknown. And at its center stood one man, calm, relentless, with ice-blue eyes and a single belief. The sovereignty and independence of our nation, he said, will be recognized by the entire world. The Sultan had lost his empire, but Kemal was about to build a nation. The year was 1921, and on paper, Greece stood stronger than ever. Its army stretched across western Anatolia, 100,000 men under the blue and white flag, marching east beneath the burning sun. Behind them, the Aegean shimmered like a promise. Ahead of them lay the endless plains that led to Ankara. They believed this would be their final campaign, the one that would secure the dream of Greater Greece forever. But Anatolia is not a land that yields easily. It tests those who walk it. The rivers dry to dust in summer, the plains stretch endlessly, and the heat blurs the horizon until even victory looks like a mirage. Still, the Greeks advanced. Towns fell, Afyon, Kütahya, Eskişehir. For every mile they gained, they lost strength. Supply lines thinned, horses collapsed, soldiers grew weary. Yet the order was clear: push forward. In Athens, Athens, King Constantine had returned to the throne, replacing Venizelos, the man who had dreamed this war into existence. But with Constantine came division. The Allies no longer trusted Greece. France withdrew its support. Britain hesitated. Greece was now fighting alone, driven by pride and the illusion of momentum. Meanwhile, in Ankara, Mustafa Kemal waited. His army was smaller, poorer, but growing. They had tasted victory at İnönü, where they stopped the Greeks twice and proved the new Turkey could fight as a nation, not just as rebels. Kemal understood something the Greek generals did not, that sometimes the land itself becomes your ally. He told his soldiers, "We shall not defend a line, but the whole country." Every hill, every ravine, every field became a fortress. By summer, the Greek army stood at the edge of the Sakarya River, less than 100 kilometers from Ankara. The city's ministers begged Kemal to evacuate. He refused. He mounted his horse, rode out under a blazing sun, and declared, "There is no defense line, only defense zones, and those zones are the hearts of our people." Then the guns began. The Battle of Sakarya raged for 22 days and nights. Artillery thundered across barren hills. Soldiers fought hand to hand over ridges that changed owners 3 times in a single day. The air was thick with dust, the smell of sweat and smoke, and the cries of the wounded carried by the wind. The Greeks pushed forward until their rifles ran empty and their canteens dry. They had marched farther than any supply could reach, and now the earth itself turned against them. By early September, the Turkish counterattack began. Cavalry swept the flanks, cutting communication lines, chasing the weary invaders back toward the west. When it was over, the plains of Sakarya were silent, littered with the wreckage of uniforms and dreams. The Greeks had not been destroyed, but they had been broken. Kemal's army stood battered, yet unbowed. Ankara still stood, and with it, the hope of a new nation. For the Greeks, it was the beginning of the end. For the Turks, it was the moment they began to believe that destiny could be reclaimed. France quickly made peace with Kemal. Italy withdrew its forces. Russia sent weapons and gold. The Allies, one by one, stepped aside. And in the quiet that followed Sakarya, both armies looked at the horizon. One trying to hold what it could, the other preparing for the strike that would finish the war once and for all. Winter came harsh and unforgiving to the plains of Anatolia. Snow settled over trenches, and soldiers huddled by dim fires, unsure what they were still fighting for. The Greek army, once proud, once unstoppable, was exhausted. Their supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of hostile land. Their leaders in Athens argued while their men starved in the cold. On the other side, Mustafa Kemal was waiting. He could sense it, the moment when strength and will would finally meet opportunity. His army was no longer a band of rebels. It was disciplined, equipped, united, and the land itself, the hills, the dust, the silence, seemed to be holding its breath. Then came August, and with it, the thunder. At dawn on August 26, 1922, the stillness of the Anatolian plateau shattered. The great offensive, Büyük Taarruz, had begun. Turkish artillery screamed across the horizon, lighting up the ridges around Afyonkarahisar. The sky burned orange before the sun even rose. Greek troops scrambled from their trenches, choking on dust and disbelief. They had thought the Turks too weak to attack, but the ground beneath them told another story. Wave after wave of Turkish infantry swept forward. The Greeks resisted bravely, but their lines broke like glass. 2 days later, Kemal's forces captured the high ground at Erkman. The Greek front collapsed. Orders from headquarters came too late. General Chatzinestis, still in Smyrna, could only listen as his army unraveled. On September 1st, Kemal rode to the front and gave the order that would echo through the next century. "Armies, your goal is the Mediterranean. Forward." The pursuit that followed was merciless. Turkish cavalry chased the retreating Greeks through burning fields and shattered villages. The earth shook with hooves. The air filled with ash. Greek soldiers fled westward, setting fire to the very towns they had once sworn to protect. Civilians followed, thousands of them, their carts heavy with children, their faces gray with dust and fear. And then the end came where it had all begun, Smyrna. By September 9th, Turkish troops entered the city. The last Greek soldiers boarded ships, leaving behind a population trapped between terror and hope. For the Greeks and Armenians of Smyrna, the nightmare had returned, but this time time, there would be no rescue. On the 13th of September, fire broke out in the Armenian quarter. Within hours, flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop, carried by the wind into the Greek districts. The sky turned crimson. The harbor glowed like molten glass. People ran toward the water, their screams drowned by the roar of the fire. Eyewitnesses later spoke of mothers holding their children as they jumped into the sea, of priests praying as smoke poured through the windows of their churches. From the decks of Allied ships anchored in the bay, sailors watched helplessly as an entire city, one of the oldest in the Mediterranean, disappeared into fire. By dawn, Smyrna was gone. Tens of thousands were dead. Hundreds of thousands more fled across the sea, clutching whatever they could carry. It was called the Asia Minor catastrophe, a name that carried the weight of centuries ending. Back in Greece, the shock became rage. A military coup swept through Athens. King Constantine was forced to abdicate again. The generals responsible for the disaster were executed by firing squad, but none of it could bring back the soldiers or the families left behind in the ashes of Asia Minor. For the Turks, it was victory, hard, bitter, and absolute. The Sultan was deposed, and Mustafa Kemal began building something entirely new, a republic, modern, secular, independent. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 fixed the borders that still exist today, but peace came at a terrible price. A forced population exchange uprooted nearly 2 million people. 1.2 million Greeks sent west, 400,000 Muslims sent east. Families torn apart, languages lost, memories exiled, and yet, from the ruins, both nations emerged, forever changed, forever bound by the same tragedy. For Greece, the dream of empire had burned away. For Turkey, a nation had been born from the smoke. Even now, a century later, the ghosts of Smyrna linger, in the songs sung by refugees, in the ruins by the sea, and in the silence that falls whenever the story is told. The Greek-Turkish War did not just end an empire. It ended an era, and it reminded the world that sometimes the cost of rebirth is everything that came before it. The fires of Smyrna eventually died, but their smoke never really left. It drifted across the Aegean, settling in songs, in memories, in the quiet prayers of those who lost everything. For Greece, the dream of empire ended on that burning shore, replaced by a nation of refugees who carried their stories instead of possessions. They built new homes on foreign soil, but their hearts never stopped hearing the waves of Ionia. For Turkey, victory meant rebirth. A new republic rose from the ashes, proud, modern, and determined to never kneel again. But even in triumph, the ghosts remain, in the faces of those forced to leave, in the echoes of villages that vanished overnight. Two peoples, one sea, and a history that binds them together in pain as much as in pride. The war ended with treaties and signatures, but the wounds it left were written deeper, in identity, in memory, in silence. To some, it was the end of an empire. To others, the beginning of freedom. To all, it was a reminder that nations are not only built by victories, but by what they lose. A century later, the ruins of Smyrna are gone, rebuilt, renamed, renewed. Yet when the wind blows over the Aegean, it still carries a trace of smoke and the faint sound of a city that once believed peace had finally come. You've been watching Erahive, where history speaks.